This is Paul Glumaz, and today is the first day of 2020. I would wish you a happy new year, but it isn't going to be very happy. It's going to be exciting. It's going to be tumultuous. It's going to be riding the roller coaster. So I don't know if that's going to make you happy or not, but anyhow, I wish you a happy new year. And this is Paul Glumaz with General Welfare Presents. In this segment, I want to give you a sense of where I think 2020 is going and what it's going to look like. Okay. The conception that is required is not a static one. You need a dynamic conception of the process that is shaping 2020. There's a dynamic process which is shaping 2020, and it's governed not by predetermined actions, but by actions that are in response and are not predetermined. In other words, you have an increasing situation where it is going to become more evident to more and more individuals, more and more people, that there are two kind of paradigms going on. Not explicitly, necessarily, are people going to say, well, this is the old paradigm and this is the new paradigm. Rather, people are going to see a process which is generating crises everywhere in the globe, in every situation you can imagine. More and more crises. People are not going to necessarily understand where those crises are being generated and are coming from, but they're going to notice that there's also efforts by nations and their leaders to try to navigate or negotiate avoiding the consequences of those crises. And it's in that process that nations and their leaders will begin to have that quality of communication and coordination that is necessary for a new paradigm. In other words, if you're dealing with a crisis being created to cause a disruption of relations and chaos, then how do you deal with that? Well, you have to somehow go around the crisis and discuss alternative pathways with those affected. And that appears to me to be the dynamic that is going to govern 2020. And I'll give you perhaps the most prime example. And as this process, before I do that, as this process occurs, more and more people will begin to line up and realize where these crises are being generated and why, which is also furthering the collaboration of those forces that do not want to experience the consequences of that crisis. Okay, perhaps the most salient and most important example of this is the Economist magazine article of a week or so ago, maybe a little longer, which is discussing how the British are going to deal with Trump, or how they're going to deal with the phenomena of Donald Trump, which they see as very problematic. And the way they see it is they're going to concentrate on disrupting the relationship between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping, between the U.S. and China, as a major focus of operations. So The Economist, which is the magazine of the financial center of London, and has been for over 150 years, is the magazine that is essentially telling those who read The Economist, who are clued into all of this, that that's the directionality of operations for the empire. Not that, so that the wider audience knows that that's where they want to go. The second one is the recognition that the turmoil that's going on in the financial system and the turmoil that's going on in the various attempts by Trump to break up the WTO system to tariffs is going to cause an economic slowdown in the United States, even if there's not a financial collapse. And the key is to then put that on to Donald Trump. So that is what you might say is a disruption, is a way to disrupt the political situation in the United States. You may call it a form of subterfuge. Okay? So essentially, that's the plan. On the other hand, you have Donald Trump saying that the phase one of the China trade deal is going to be signed on the 15th of January. Okay, which is the first phase. Now, what's not being discussed in the open media, but was discussed by the Chinese media, is that China has been lowering tariffs to U.S. industries, especially, that are medium size and smaller and medium size, which are actually not the multinationals. And what they've been doing is lowering tariffs and creating an environment for them to export into China. So there's a behind-the-scenes collaboration economically between those middle-sized and small-sized industries and manufacturing and farms and what have you, that are the backbone of the support for Trump in the economic sphere. If you understand that the mega corporations per se, the transnational, non-national entities that are huge, and the financial structure are not necessarily pro-Trump. They're not. But where is the Trump support in the U.S. among the economic specter is going to be in the manufacturing and in this medium size, and so China is giving them a break. So what does that say? There is a kind of understanding between the U.S. and China beyond the actual trade deal, which is collaborative. Okay, but you're not going to see that. It came out in a Chinese article in the Chinese press, but you're not going to see that aspect of it. Okay, so that's another example of subterfuge and an attempt to deal with the subterfuge. So there's this massive campaign going on in the United States where large flows of money are going into a cult known as the Falun Gong, which runs this Chinese spectacular show called Shunyan. And that grouping is, and the Steve Bannon and a whole bunch of these other groupings are on a jihad to destroy relations with China. And there's also a lot of congressional elements that are Republican congressional elements that are sympathetic to that. But Trump cannot have a disruption of those relations, because only a China-U.S. relationship can deal with preventing the destruction of both China and the United States, but especially the United States. So that's one aspect. The Chinese don't want the dollar destroyed, and neither does Trump. So that takes me to the next one. This is the ultimate in subterfuge, an attack on industrial society, which is now getting underway in the number one banker in the world, the head of the Bank of England, also head of the Financial Stability Board, Mark Carney, is now departed from the Bank of England and the Financial Stability Board to become the special UN envoy on climate change and finance. And what they're doing, and his partner in this is the presidential candidate Mike Bloomberg. What they're doing is organizing the financial community to cut off lending to all the energy sectors in oil, gas, coal, etc. At the same time as cutting off lending to the primary users of coal, gas. That's subterfuge. That's a direct attack on the economic base that would oppose the globalism, the potential patriotic economic base of industry and commerce in the various countries that would oppose these policies, the Green New Deal. But more importantly, it is an attack on that. So how do you deal with the cutoff of funding to this situation? So here's where you have to come up with a creative solution between nations and within a nation to do that. And obviously, the creative solution is that governments can issue credit. Hamilton pioneered that. Lincoln pioneered that with the greenbacks. FDR pioneered that with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. So that reality is now possible. It's always been possible. But now, how are you going to deal with the cutoff of credit? Well, the nation can create its own credit. And if it can do that, then why do you need Wall Street in the City of London to go to them and beg them for money, for infrastructure and for development? So that is the kind of, otherwise you're going to have chaos. Otherwise you're going to have a destruction of the situation. So that's another example of the kind of process you're going to see in 2020, where the impulse of nations to survive in this period cannot be accomplished without these kind of relationships with other nations and these kind of solutions to deal with those. Okay, so you have a British press being upset that there was a conversation between Putin and Donald Trump, where Putin was thanking Donald Trump for the assistance that the U.S. Intelligence provided for the Soviet intelligence, Russian intelligence to break up a network that was planning to bomb St. Petersburg Cathedral at a very important time in Hollywood. It would have had an incredible impact. But in this case, the U.S. collaborated with Russia. So what does this mean? That means there are channels of communication going on to prevent this kind of disruption, this kind of subterfuge. Okay, so this is what you're dealing with. Okay. So these are examples of a process that's heading in a certain direction, a process of disruption. So what is being disrupted? Well, there is a process by which Russia is moving forward. China is moving forward with the Belt and Road. More and more of the world is participating. Russia's coming more and more into a position of stability and strength. And Vladimir Putin Russia has just demonstrated or has now deployed the avant-garde glide missile that is indefensible. And this has completely changed the military strategic nuclear chessboard completely. So it's going to be much harder to convince the NATO and the U.S. military that a preemptive nuclear war is a winnable deal. So that's another example of a stabilizing impact. However, this also means that more and more disruptions below the level of a full nuclear war are to be expected from the British. Disruptions in India, disruptions in Somalia, disruptions in everywhere in the world. Bolivia, more disruptions in Venezuela, more attempts to set off everything. Every part of the world, this is game at this point. One of the major things that is going on right now is that Turkey is now preparing to send military forces to support the government of national accord, which is a bunch of leftover jihadis, backed by the United Nations, but not by Russia, not by Egypt, not by Saudi Arabia, not by the United Arab Emirates. And there's another process going on where General Haftar, who leads the Libyan National Army, is about to consolidate a unified Libya. Now, that situation is very complicated, and because of the pressure of Egypt and the UAE on the United States and on Trump, Donald Trump is inclined towards supporting Haftar. But the U.S. State Department, which has been very much involved with the Muslim Brotherhood during the Obama years and the government of national accord in Tripoli and their elements in Misrata, they are very much a continuation of the Obama policy of supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. They seem to be opposed. So you have a division inside U.S. policy over this situation. Now, Erdogan is getting very cheap oil from that part of Libya, which is under the control of the General Accord government. Some people say as low as $10 a barrel. And a lot of these networks were developed by Turkey during the Obama period, centered on the Muslim Brotherhood, that span Sudan and Somalia and all these places, span throughout the northern part of. So now you have the specter of Turkish troops going in to perpetuate a continued civil war and preventing Haftar from consolidating a nation. Haftar is basically a coalition of many different forces. It's not a really strong unified group, but the idea is that it's the Libyan National Army. Everybody's part of it. So this whole thing is another wrinkle in the whole thing, but this will then plunge Turkey militarily into these wars in Africa. And not just in Libya, but spread out throughout Africa, because Turkey has invested a lot in developing influence in this part of the world, which is part of their whole Obama, the promise of the Obama relationship between Erdogan and. So next week, Putin goes to meet with Erdogan. Obviously, the Russians are not directly involved in Libya, but Egypt sort of is. And so now you have to somehow try to convince Erdogan not to do this or to do something less. So then what concession are you also going to be giving to Erdogan? So this is the kind of world that we live in. But this whole environment of civil war is the British. They want to keep people in that mode. They don't want a resolution of any of these situations. You see that most emphatically in the United States. What do you see in the United States? Well, you have this democratic partisan impeachment of the President of the United States. But they're withholding, or they're planning to withhold, sending the impeachment articles to the Senate. Why? Because they don't want the whole process to come to an end with the Senate saying that, we now, either dismissing it or having a speedy trial or something like that, and then we're voting and that's it. They want to keep it going. Keep the tension up. That's the strategy. So in the process of doing that, you can go to these you have time for people to organize a lot of money to go to the wavering Republicans. Collins in Maine, Murkowski and, what's his name? I think the former presidential candidate, whatever his name is, the Mormon. He's
Romney.
Romney, yeah. He's also part of that. And there's this whole Republican now spreading dissent to try to play more games to keep this thing going. Okay, so it's like there's no resolution. It's to keep it going, to keep the turmoil going, and so that's the kind of process you'll see more and more of in 2020. But all of that leads to a situation where, to prevent the consequences that a impeachment will do to the United States, which would be catastrophic, and to prevent the consequences of a full-blown military involvement of Turkey in Africa, to prevent the consequences of the green redlining of industry by the international bankers, to prevent the consequences of the collapse of U.S.-China relations, you have to come up with creative flanks, creative initiatives. And it's that process of creativity involved in the situation which is going to be determining. Because you don't know how this is all going to turn out. Because you don't know how the British are going to respond. And you don't know how the counter-response is going to be. But the world's heading towards this counter-response process. And that's going to dominate everything in the world. And it's not just in one place. It's in every part of the world. This is how it's working. In every part not one part of the world is exempt. The illegitimate government of Bolivia, a bunch of right-wing Catholic nutcases, just call for the expulsion of the Mexican and Spanish ambassador to trigger a conflict between them, Mexico, and Spain. Why? Because that's all part of the process. Evo Morales is in Argentina, but he was saved by Mexico. So they're trying to trigger bringing Mexico into a confrontation with Bolivia. Mexico doesn't want to have a confrontation with any country in Latin America because it's part of their constitution. They are not, the Mexican constitution does not allow Mexico to be partisan to internal conflicts in other countries. But that's an example. That's another example. There's many, many more examples. You can keep going on. And so there is the provocation. And also, and this goes on a domestic level, it goes on an international level, it goes on there's not one part in the world that you can name where this is not the case. Take Hong Kong. Take Xinjiang province where the Uyghurs are. They're all talking about these concentration camps and, everything. Well, guess what? They were not concentration camps. Yes, these people were, these men, primarily men, were sent to these facilities. And they were, these were Uyghurs who were not employable. They didn't have enough education or vocational training. So that's what they did. That's what it was. It was China's answer to terrorism, a creative answer. How do you answer terrorism? Well, the Chinese answered by placing all these potential recruitables who are poor and have no education and are desperate into terrorist organizations, which could have occurred because a number of these Uyghurs, who are Turks, were in ISIS and al-Nusra and so on and so forth. Instead, they did a mass effort to put these young men in these so-called concentration camps, but they weren't concentration camps. They were vocational, educational, and the Chinese are very clear that to preserve the culture of these people, so they had access to their religion and their culture. No, the Chinese don't mess with that. Xi Jinping does not mess with anybody's culture. You got your culture, we're going to defend your culture. So what they did there is, and now we have an announcement from the Chinese that though all these so-called concentration camps are now closed, they're empty, because everybody's graduated. So, and you haven't had any terrorist attacks in the last few years, because the people who would have been recruited to those terrorist organizations instead got vocational training and education. My God, that's a crime, isn't it? It's a crime to do that. You're interfering with their right to become a terrorist, right? Well, no, you're giving them an alternative option for a different future. So we don't do that. We didn't do that in Iraq. We didn't do that in anywhere we went. What we did was we actually helped create more terrorism by our actions. So that's another example of a creative approach, and you wouldn't anticipate, but that is the way it works. That's how you actually deal with terrorism. You take an entire generation of young men who could become terrorists and you give them an alternative. You give them an ability to earn a decent living. So that's 2020 for you. It's going to be a very unusual year. It's going to be a very creative year. It's going to be multiple disruptions everywhere in the world are going to have to be dealt with. And the potential to deal with them exists, and the creativity to deal with them exists, but there's no predetermination in this respect.